Okay, so you know how this works, right? You send us the stuff you want to know more about.
And we deep dive into it.
Yeah, we deep dive into it like a crash course or whatever.
Yeah.
So today we're taking on, well, it's a pretty wild story. It's called Operation Snow White.
Oh, yeah, this is a big one. A lot of twists and turns with this one.
It is. It really is. So for everyone listening, we're talking about this big criminal conspiracy thing that the Church of Scientology pulled off back in the
The
70s.
70s were a wild time.
They were. Okay, so we've got excerpts from the Wikipedia article on Operation Snow White as the main source material here. So we really want to try to wrap our heads around just how big this whole thing was.
All right,
Like,
yeah.
how did they actually pull it off? And then, what happened after it all went down?
Fallout, yeah.
Exactly, the
Yeah.
fallout. Okay, so Operation Snow White. The name, it almost sounds like innocent.
Right,
So
it does. Very misleading.
totally. But what actually happened was anything but innocent. So where did this whole crazy idea even come from in the first place?
Well, believe it or not, the seeds for this were planted way before the 70s. Like all the way back in 1960, L. Ron Hubbard, he's the founder of Scientology, he actually suggested that Scientologists should try to get jobs in government agencies.
Oh, wow. So it was like a long-term plan.
Yeah, it wasn't just about getting a foot in the door, it was more strategic than that. It seems like they wanted to gain access to information or maybe even try to influence things from the inside down the line.
That's pretty sneaky. Like planting those seeds years ahead of time.
So then we get to the early 70s, and suddenly the church is getting a lot of unwanted attention from the feds.
Yeah, they were definitely on the radar. The article mentions a bunch of stuff happening around then. First, you had that FDA raid back in '63, which showed that the government was already concerned about them. Then in the '70s, the IRS was all over them about tax claims.
Yeah, the IRS doesn't mess around. No, they don't. And on top of that, the FBI had started their own investigation into the church's activities. So basically, they were being scrutinized from every angle.
That must have been pretty stressful for them. So, facing all that pressure, how did the church respond?
They weren't just going to sit back and take it. They had a kind of a multi-pronged strategy, you could say. They went on the offensive with public relations, trying to manage their image. They also went after the IRS with some pretty big lawsuits.
Fighting fire with fire.
Exactly. And then, this is the part that's most relevant to our deep dive, they started systematically infiltrating government offices. This wasn't just about reacting, it was about getting ahead of the game, gathering intel, and potentially neutralizing threats before they became a problem.
Sounds like a spy movie. So this whole infiltration operation, was it like a rogue group of Scientologists, or was this coming from the top?
Oh no, this was organized. It was all run by a specific department within the church called the Guardian's Office, or JOGO for short.
So the Jigo, who were they exactly?
Well, they were created by Hubbard himself back in 1966. Their job was basically to protect Scientology and make sure it thrived. By the time Operation Snow White started, the Trudeau was a pretty big deal internationally. They had their worldwide headquarters in England at a place called St. Hill Manor, and their U.S. headquarters was in Los Angeles.
Okay, so this is sounding more and more like a major operation, not just some small-time thing.
Oh, absolutely. And they had smaller offices strategically located, too, like in Washington, D.C., which, as we'll get into, became a major hub for their infiltration activities.
So they had this network of offices working together.
Yeah, exactly. The Togo was very organized. They had 5 different bureaus within each of these main offices. One of those was the Information Bureau, and that's the one that was responsible for, planning and carrying out the infiltration stuff. Operation Snow White was their baby, basically.
Okay, so there's this whole hierarchy.
Yeah.
Who was calling the shots at the very top? L. Ron Hubbard, obviously. But wasn't Mary Sue Hubbard also a major player?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Hubbard was still in control, strategically speaking, but his wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, she had this very powerful position called Commodore Staff Guardian. Basically, that meant she ran the day-to-day stuff within the DIGO. She was making some key decisions there.
Okay, so we've got increasing government scrutiny, and the Guardian's office, with the Hubbards at the helm, decides to get really, really proactive. When does Operation Snow White officially kick off?
1973, that's when the BIGO really starts this massive infiltration campaign. They were going after governments all over the globe, but the U.S. was their main target by far.
So was this all just about the IRS? Were they just trying to Get out of paying taxes?
Well, the IRS was a huge factor, no doubt, but it wasn't the whole story. The Gaga was super worried about Scientology's reputation in the long run. They even wanted to infiltrate Interpol, that international police organization.
Oh, why Interpol?
They wanted to get their hands on any documents Interpol had about Scientology or Hubbard, anything that could be used against them. Jane Kember, she was a big shot in the MAGA, she put Henning Helt in charge of that mission.
So it wasn't just about defending themselves against the IRS. They were trying to control the narrative around Hubbard on a global scale.
Exactly. Around the same time, Hubbard issued something called Guardian Order 732. This was a major turning point in the whole Operation Snow White thing.
What was in that order?
Well, it basically called for the removal and correction, those were their words, of any files about Scientology that they thought were erroneous. In the beginning, they said they wanted to do this through legal channels.
But that didn't last long, right?
No, they went rogue pretty fast.
So, the article says Hubbard was named an unindicted co-conspirator later on. And some Scientologists claim that he was just misunderstood. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that Guardian Order 732, while it might have started with good intentions, it quickly turned into something illegal. I mean, the fact that Hubbard was named an unindicted co-conspirator by federal prosecutors suggests they believed he was in on the whole thing, or at least knew about it.
That's a pretty big deal.
It is. The "we just misunderstood him" defense is something you often see in organizations with a strong hierarchy. They want to protect the leader, so they claim he was out of the loop even when the evidence suggests otherwise.
Plausible deniability, as they say.
Exactly. But things took even more specific turn with another directive, Guardian Order 1361.
So what was different about this one?
Well, this one came from Jane Kember and was directed to Henning Helt, Duke Snyder, and Richard Weigand. It specifically called for the infiltration of IRS offices in Los Angeles and London. Oh, and they also wanted to infiltrate the Department of Justice. They were going right for the agencies that were causing them the most problems.
So they're not messing around at this point. They stopped there.
Oh, not even close. They tried to get people into all sorts of government offices. The article mentions the DEA, the Coast Guard Intelligence, even the National Institute of Mental Health and the American Medical Association.
Whoa, the AMA. What were they after there?
It's not entirely clear, but they seem to think they had enemies everywhere. And to make sure they got people in these places, they offered rewards. Like if you successfully infiltrated one of these agencies, you'd get a bonus or something.
That's crazy. Rewards for infiltrating government agencies.
Yeah.
That's like something out of a spy novel.
And they didn't stop at just gathering information, did they? There's this thing called Operation Cat, where they wanted to plant fake information too, right?
Yeah, that was a weird one. That was Hubbard's idea, apparently. The plan was to put fake records about a cat with a totally ridiculous name into U.S. security agency computer systems.
Wait, a cat?
Yeah, a cat. They thought that if they exposed this, it would make American security look foolish, like a big joke. It's hard to say what they were really hoping to achieve with that. Maybe sow some chaos or just discredit those agencies. Operation Cat. Wow. Okay, so let's talk about how they actually put Operation Snow White into action. The article mentions Michael Meisner and Gerald Wolfe, who were both working for the IRS.
Yeah, Meisner and Wolfe, they were key players. Meisner was appointed as Assistant Guardian for Information in D.C. in early 1974. They called it AGI-DC. He was basically in charge of carrying out the Information Bureau's orders in D.C., and he reported to Duke Snyder, the Assistant Guardian for D.C., the top Bajego guy in Washington.
So Meisner was the boots on the ground, making things happen in D.C., and one of his first jobs was to get those Interpol documents we talked about earlier, right?
Right. In July 74, he gets orders to go after those Interpol documents, which were at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. But that was just the beginning for him. He had a lot more on his plate.
So what else did he get roped into?
By August, Cindy Raymond, who was the JEGO's collections officer for the entire U.S., gives Meisner a new assignment. She wants him to find a Scientologist who can get a job at the IRS headquarters in D.C. Their goal was to steal any documents related to Scientology, especially anything having to do with their legal battles with the government. And that's where Gerald Wolfe comes in.
You're right, Wolfe. He was already working at the IRS. How'd they get him involved?
Well, it sounds like it took some convincing. Apparently, Meisner spent like a month interviewing different Scientologists, but couldn't find anyone suitable who was actually willing to do something that risky. In the end, Raymond told him that she'd handpicked Gerald Wolfe for the job.
Okay, so they've got their inside man. Now the operation can really get going. How did they start getting the information they were after?
Well, Wolfe and Meisner both had pretty low-level jobs at the IRS. They were clerk typists. which is kind of ironic when you think about it.
Totally.
Mhm.
Sneaking around in plain sight.
Exactly. So Wolf starts going through files, looking for anything related to tax-exempt organizations, and whenever he got the order, he'd illegally copy documents that the Chogo wanted.
And Meisner was his handler, basically.
Pretty much. Meisner was supervising Wolf and also overseeing all the Information Bureau stuff happening in D.C. He was the one reporting back to the Chogo's deputy guardian for information in the U.S.
It was like a mini spy ring right there in the IRS. Now, the article mentions a pretty crazy incident involving a bugged IRS meeting. Did they really bug a meeting?
Yeah, they did. In November 74, the Chogo found out that the IRS was going to have this meeting to talk about Scientology's tax-exempt status. So what did they do? They sent a spy to secretly record the whole thing.
Seriously, how'd they even manage that?
The spy, the article just calls him Herman, he broke into the conference room the day before the meeting and planted a bug. He plugged it into an electrical outlet, and it transmitted an FM signal that other Scientologists were picking up from a car across the street.
So they had a whole team working on this.
Oh yeah, they were organized. After the meeting, Herman went back and got the bug, and they sent the recording straight to L.A.
That's incredible. They were taking some huge risks.
Yeah.
And while all that was happening, they were still stealing physical documents, too.
Oh yeah, they were busy. By December, just a month after the bug meeting, Wolf, Herman, and Meisner had managed to steal a 20-inch stack of documents. That's a lot of paper.
That is a lot of paper. And did they just grab whatever they could, or were they looking for specific things?
Well, they seemed to be getting bolder with what they were taking. In late December, Wolf started stealing documents straight from the IRS chief counsel's office. And then right after Christmas, he broke into the office of an IRS attorney named Barbara Bird, who'd been at that bugged meeting. But instead of taking her files, he used the IRS's photocopier and paper to make copies of the documents he wanted.
Wow, using their own resources against them. Did they have a system for figuring out what all these stolen documents said?
Yeah, it was all very organized. Wolf would meet Meisner at a restaurant, give him the documents, and Meisner would go through them, highlight the important stuff, and write summaries. Then that info would be sent up the chain of command to the Dego in L.A. Mary Sue Hubbard even got a copy of some of this stuff.
So by early 75, Operation Snow White was in full swing. But they were just getting started, right? They were branching out to other government agencies, too.
Right. The article mentions a couple of other people who were recruited. Sharon Thomas, they got her a job at the Coast Guard Intelligence Agency. And Nancy Douglas, she got a job at the DEA. Both of them started stealing and copying documents for the JEGO.
It's like a whole network of spies. And all this time, the pressure's on. They still haven't gotten their tax-exempt status back.
Yeah, the heat was definitely on. In the spring of 75, Mary Sue Hubbard actually told Kember and Helt to use any method at our disposal to win the battle and gain our nonprofit tax status. So they're basically given a blank check to do whatever it takes. And Helt ordered the Information Bureau to collect all IRS and Department of Justice tax files within 3 months.
Wow, 3 months. That's a tight deadline. And they did end up targeting the Justice Department pretty aggressively, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. In April 75, Meisner got hold of a Justice Department directory and figured out which offices were most likely to have files on Scientology. Then he sent Wolf to break into 2 different attorneys' offices, 3 Saturdays in a row. Wolf managed to copy 12 files that had information about the government's legal strategy in cases against Scientology.
That's a pretty big advantage, knowing what your opponent's going to do.
Absolutely. And to try and cover their tracks, they came up with this crazy scheme called Project Horn.
Project Horn. What was that all about?
It was an elaborate disinformation campaign. The idea was to make it look like someone inside the IRS was leaking information about Scientology. So they stole documents related to other groups, not just Scientology, and they stole some IRS stationery.
To forge letters.
Exactly. They were going to write fake letters from a disgruntled IRS employee and send all the stolen files, including the Scientology ones, with those letters. They wanted to make it look like an inside job, like some rogue agent was just randomly sending out confidential information.
That's pretty clever, actually. And it seems like Wolf was kind of freelancing a bit during this time, stealing things that weren't even on the Dago's list.
Yeah, it seems like he got a little carried away. When he was stealing the IRS stationery for Project Horn, he also took some files about the Unification Church and Bob Jones University.
Just for fun.
Who knows? Maybe he thought they might be useful someday. But while all this was going on, the church was also playing it straight, at least on the surface. They filed a FOIA lawsuit against the IRS.
Right, the Freedom of Information Act. That's a legal way to request government documents.
Yeah, but even while they were doing that, they were still breaking the law and targeting the people involved in the FOIA process.
They really wanted those files. Who were they targeting?
The main guy was Charles Zurevin. He was the government's lawyer for the FOIA case. Cindy Raymond told Meisner to keep tabs on Zurevin, and Meisner passed the job on to Wolf. So Wolf broke into Zurevin's office several times between July and November of 75.
They weren't afraid of anything.
Nope. And those break-ins ended up being super informative. Wolf found out that Zurevin was putting together a big index of all the Scientology files the IRS had. This was for the FOIA case, so they could keep track of all the documents and decide what they could redact. But for the Singo, it was like a treasure map.
They were handed a list of everything the IRS had on them.
Exactly. By October, Zurevin had finished the index and numbered every document. And a copy of that index was given to Scientology's lawyers as part of the legal process.
So, of course, those lawyers passed the index right along to the Jura.
Of course. And then Wolf used that index to go back to Zurevin's office and copy all the documents that were listed. It was almost too easy.
Wow. So they were playing both sides, being sneaky and going through the legal channels at the same time.
Yeah.
But it seems like they never really stopped being sneaky. What about this Guardian Program Order 158? What was that all about?
Right. So in December 75, Jane Kemmer issues this order, Guardian Program Order 158. The idea was to give Hubbard advance warning if any legal action was coming his way. So they needed to get inside agencies that had the power to issue subpoenas or that might know about any legal moves against Hubbard.
Makes sense. They wanted to protect their leader. Which agencies were they after this time?
They were looking at the U.S. Attorney's offices in D.C. and L.A., the IRS Office of International Operations, the DEA, Coast Guard, and Immigration and Naturalization, basically all the big ones. But Meisner, he had a different target in mind.
Oh, who was he after?
He decided to go after the Department of Justice directly, not the U.S. Attorney's office, but the whole department. It was a pretty bold move.
So they brought in more people to help with this, right?
Yeah, in January 76, they send Don Alverzo to D.C. He was supposed to be this master lockpicker, and he was immediately put to work. The day after he arrives, he, Wolf, and Meisner break into an office at the Justice Department.
Whose office was it?
A guy named Louis Hubbard, no relation to L. Ron Hubbard. They also broke into the file room where Zurevin kept all those Scientology files. Wolf was the lookout. Alverzo worked on picking the lock to Louis Hubbard's office, and Meisner tried to get into Zurevin's file room. They actually struggled with Zurevin's door for over an hour, but then Meisner accidentally bumped it or kicked it or something, and it just swung open. They grabbed all the Scientology documents and photocopied them. Then they went into Louis Hubbard's office and copied files until about 2 in the morning.
So was that break-in finally the one that got them the IRS documents they had been after for so long? It was from Guardian Order 1361.
You know what? It was. Less than a month later, Richard Wagon told Jane Kember that they finally had all the documents from that order, 2 years of sneaking around, and they finally got what they wanted.
That's crazy. But they didn't stop there, did they?
Oh no, they were just getting started. Wolf and Meisner made themselves fake IRS ID cards, and that gave them access to the federal courthouse in Washington. They used those fake IDs, along with Wolf's real ID, to get into restricted areas and steal even more documents.
It's just unbelievable how much they were able to get away with. And the orders to keep doing this were still coming from the top, weren't they?
Oh yeah, the Weavy-Go was still running the show. Guardian Program Order 302. It was written by Cindy Raymond and approved by Mary Sue Hubbard. It basically said they had to keep infiltrating any government agencies that weren't handing over files they'd requested through FOIA. So they were still getting instructions from the Hubbards.
It sounds like things started to get a little too risky even for them, though, right?
Yeah.
What about that incident at the IRS's Office of International Operations?
Yeah, that one was close. In April 76, Meisner and Wolf tried to get into an office at the Office of International Operations. A cleaning lady saw them and thought they were acting suspicious, so she reported them to a security guard.
Busted.
Pretty much. Wolf showed his real IRS ID, and Meisner showed his fake one. But for some reason, the guard believed them. He even made the cleaning lady open the office door for them. So they got in, grabbed a bunch of files, and since they couldn't find a copy machine there, they took the files to the main IRS building, used their IDs to get in, photocopied everything, and then put the original files back. The whole thing took them like 4 hours.
4 hours.
Yeah.
Right under everyone's noses.
That's right. But their luck was about to run out. Things really started to fall apart at the U.S. courthouse in Washington.
What happened there?
Well, in May, Wolf broke into the courthouse and stole the keys to an assistant U.S. attorney's office. The attorney's name was Nathan Dodell, and he was involved in a Scientology FOIA case.
So they were going after the people who were going after them.
Exactly. They wanted to know what Dodell was up to. Wolf had copies of the keys made and then put the originals back. A few weeks later, he and Meisner used those copied keys to break into Dodell's office and steal documents related to the FOIA case.
What were they looking for?
Well, there was talk about possibly deposing L. Ron Hubbard in the case, and the church really didn't want that to happen, so they wanted to know what Dodell was thinking and planning.
So they break into his office. What happens next?
Well, they start doing this thing where they sign into the courthouse library, get a key to the elevator, go up to the library, but then sneak out a back door that leads to the hallway where Dodell's office is. They use the stolen keys to get in, steal documents, copy them, and then put the originals back. They did this at least twice.
That's pretty bold. Didn't anyone notice?
Well, the night librarian, a guy named Johnson, he started to get suspicious. The second time they did this, Johnson saw that they hadn't signed in at the main desk. He told them they couldn't come back without permission from the day librarian. And then a few days later, he reported them to the U.S. Attorney's Office. He and the night guard were told to call the FBI if they saw Wolf and Meisner again.
So the FBI is on their trail now. But the John Juror wasn't giving up, were they?
Nope. Even after that close call, Herman ordered Meisner to go back to Dodell's office and steal his personal files. They wanted to use that information to get Dodell removed from his position as assistant U.S. attorney. It was getting personal.
Yeah, it was way past just gathering information at this point. This was about revenge. What happened when they went back to the courthouse?
Well, on June 11th, they go back to the courthouse, sign in, and go to the library. Johnson, the librarian, sees them right away and tries to stop them, but Meisner shows him a letter that he says is from the head librarian. But while they're waiting for the cleaning ladies to finish up in Dodell's office, Johnson calls the FBI.
And that's the end of the line.
Pretty much. The FBI shows up and confronts Wolf and Meisner. Wolf shows his real IRS ID. Meisner shows his fake one and makes up a story about how he recently resigned from the IRS and they're just doing legal research. Neither one of them mentions Scientology.
And the FBI just let him go.
Yeah, they let them go after questioning them. But Meisner calls Herman right away and Herman tells him to get out of D.C. and go to L.A. immediately.
So the jig is up. What happened next?
Well, the issue gave Meisner and Wolf fake cover stories to try and protect them. But on June 30th, Wolf gets arrested for using a fake government ID. And the next day, Mary Sue Hubbard writes a letter to Vigan talking about Wolf's arrest, the cover story, and how they're going to destroy any evidence that connects Wolf and Meisner to Scientology.
Cover-up time.
Yeah, they're full panic mode at this point. But it's too late. By the end of July, the judge decides that Wolf's case is serious enough to go to a grand jury, and they issue an arrest warrant for Meisner, who's still hiding out in L.A.
So the walls are closing in. What happens to Meisner?
Well, he's laying low, but as the investigation goes on, it becomes pretty clear that Scientology is in big trouble. By January 77, Meisner starts to get really nervous and wants to turn himself in, but the Jizgo is keeping him under guard.
Wow, they're holding him prisoner.
Pretty much. Then, in May 77, Wolf pleads guilty. Later that month, Meisner actually escapes from the Jizgo, but they convince him to come back the next day. But then, in June, after Wolf testifies to the grand jury, Meisner escapes again, and this time he goes straight to the FBI.
He flips on them.
Yep. He agrees to plead guilty to a 5-year felony charge for conspiracy, and he promises to cooperate with the grand jury. And that's when the FBI really drops the hammer.
What do they do?
On July 8th, 1977, they raid Church of Scientology locations in Los Angeles, Hollywood, and Washington, D.C. The raid in LA is huge. They have 156 agents involved, and they seize a ton of documents.
How much is a ton of documents?
16 tons. It was enough to fill up a 16-ton truck.
Wow, that's a lot of evidence.
It was. And all those documents, they showed just how much illegal stuff the church was involved in. Not just Operation Snow White, but other things too, like a plan to frame Paulette Cooper and plots against other people they saw as enemies.
So how did the church react to the raids?
They were furious. They accused the FBI of acting like the Gestapo and said the raids were illegal. But the FBI had a warrant, it was like 40 pages long, and listed out 160 specific items they were looking for.
So did they get the documents back?
Well, there were some legal challenges. A judge in Washington initially said that the documents should be returned to the church, but that ruling was overturned pretty quickly. Scientology tried to appeal to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court refused to hear the case.
So the FBI kept the documents.
They did. And in August 78, 11 high-ranking Scientologists were indicted on 28 different charges. Mary Sue Hubbard was one of them. L. Ron Hubbard wasn't indicted, but he was named as an unindicted co-conspirator.
So what happened next? Did it go to trial?
Well, the church tried everything to fight the charges. They tried to get one of the judges removed from the case, and they subpoenaed almost 150 FBI agents. They were also giving all these different explanations for what they'd been doing, and the explanations kept changing.
It sounds like they were trying to delay things as long as possible.
Yeah, I think they were hoping it would all just go away. But in the end, they knew they couldn't win, so they agreed to a plea deal.
What were the terms of the deal?
7 of them pleaded guilty to conspiracy to obstruct justice. 1 pleaded guilty to a similar charge, and 1 pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor. The deal allowed them to try and get some of the evidence thrown out, but it also meant they were admitting they were guilty.
And what about the sentencing?
It all went down in December 1979. 5 of the Scientologists were sentenced to 4 years in prison and fined $10,000 each. 4 of them were taken into custody right away. Mary Sue Hubbard got 5 years and a $10,000 fine. The next day, the other 4 Scientologists were sentenced. 3 of them got 5 years and a $10,000 fine, and 1 got 6 months and a $1,000 fine. Mary Sue Hubbard also got 5 years of probation and had to do community service after she got out of prison. They all appealed the sentences, but the appeals didn't go anywhere.
Wow, that's a pretty big fall from grace. What about the 2 Scientologists in England?
They were convicted too. In November 1980, Jane Kember and Mo Budlong were convicted in the UK on 9 counts of aiding and abetting burglary. They both got 6 years. They tried to get political asylum in the UK, saying their actions were political and they shouldn't be extradited, but the British High Court said no.
So they ended up in prison too.
That's right. So in the end, all those people involved in Operation Snow White, Mary Sue Hubbard, Cindy Raymond, Gerald Wolfe, Henning Helt, Duke Snyder, Gregory Willardson, Richard Wygand, Mitchell Herman, Sharon Thomas, Jane Kember, and Mo Budlong, they all ended up facing justice.
And what about L. Ron Hubbard? He was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. Did he ever face charges?
No, he never did. He went into hiding and stayed there until he died.
So this whole scandal, it must have been really bad for Scientology's image.
Oh, it was huge. It was one of the biggest scandals in the church's history. And the church has never really addressed it directly. They usually just say that the Trigo was infiltrated and set up and that the people involved were all kicked out, even though some of them stayed in the church. They've even said that the operatives involved had done nothing more serious than steal photocopier paper, which is ridiculous considering everything they did.
So they're still trying to downplay it all these years later.
Yeah, pretty much. But it's hard to downplay something this big. Operation Snow White wasn't just happening in the US, it was happening in Canada too. And it involved a lot of people, something like 5,000 covert operatives.
5,000.
Yeah, and they infiltrated 136 different agencies in over 30 countries. It was one of the biggest government infiltration operations in U.S. history.
That's just mind-blowing. When you think about how much planning and coordination went into this whole thing, it really makes you wonder, how far would other organizations go to protect themselves?
Right. What would they be willing to do to control information and keep their secrets?
It makes you think. And that's something for everyone listening to ponder.
Definitely. Something to think about.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.